for me to share this session. So I would like to introduce our first speaker today, Sophie CHADELLE. Sophie is a PhD candidate at the University of Toulouse, Jean-Jaurès in France, and she is writing a dissertation that lies within the fields of translation studies, gender studies, and audiovisual studies. The focus of a dissertation is on the representation of the female voice in North American series and their French translation. So the title of her presentation is Reclaiming the Power of the Female Voice on Screen, a methodology to study gender in the French audiovisual translation of Sex and the City. Sophie, the screen is yours.
Okay. First, thank you, Serenella, for your presentation, and I'd like to thank everybody for the organisation of this seminar, and I'm very happy to be part of this super interesting project, and very glad to be sharing with you my work. So Sex and the City is a well-known American TV series, which was created by Darren Star on HBO and broadcast on HBO between 1998 and 2004. It relates the love and sex lives of 4 emancipated women living in Manhattan. This show was considered by most TV scholars, as well as by the media, as being a decisive turning point in terms of discourse on female identities. According to Diane Negra, the most subversive dimension of the show is its daring stance on female sexuality and the way the 4 characters are presented as not being afraid to voice their personal feelings, their opinions, and their anxieties about their most intimate experiences as single women in a somewhat conservative New York society. In that show, the centrality of female voices is undeniable. The series' narrative structure is built around the debates between the 4 friends, and the confrontation of the 4 individual voices adds complexity, nuance, and plurality to the representation of female identities on screen. So today I'll talk about the audiovisual translation, the AVT, of these female voices in the French dubbing and subtitling of the American show. I will attempt to analyze the link between gender, translation, and TV studies by focusing on the methodological aspect of my research. I wish to demonstrate why the analysis of the translation of female voices on screen, considered as minority voices, should necessarily be pluridisciplinary, and to what extent this pluridisciplinary approach poses very interesting challenges and raises many questions. How do you analyze the AVT of a series, and what are the differences with the analysis of the translation of a literary text, for instance? What do you take into account? And when you compare the original version with the translated version in terms of gender identities, do you necessarily pass a judgment? How can you limit your own subjectivity or activism when doing so in order to lead the best scientific demonstration possible? In order to analyze the way the AVT possibly manipulates the political discourse on minority voices, what do you look at? Should you just take into account the dialogues? And finally, how do you link in your methodology film and TV studies with translation studies? So in order to answer to all these questions, here is my outline. So first, I'm going to tackle the concept of minority voice in feminist film theory. Then I'll talk about feminist translation theory. I will analyze previous works done on the French version of Sex and the City. I'll talk about my feminist methodology to translation studies, and I will give you an example of one of my multimodal translation analysis. I'll analyze the figure of the toxic bachelor. So I'd like to begin my presentation by focusing on the concept of voice and its importance in film and TV studies, and in particular feminist film and TV studies. Many feminist film scholars have analysed the concept of voice in their work on the oppression of female identities on screen. And here are a couple of examples of feminist scholars whose work I've studied in order to analyse the French AVT of the show from a pluridisciplinary point of view. Anaïs Lefebvre-Berthelot, in her book Speak Up, des coulisses à l'écran, voix de femmes et séries américaines à l'orée du 21e siècle, points out that the English word voice, the verb to voice, underlines the importance of the activist dimension of the concept of voice on screen. To voice something is to express the political views of some minorities and thus to give agency to these minorities. Mary Ann Doan highlights the political dimension of the voice, since the concept of voice on screen has for a long time been considered as a minor element of the audiovisual and filmic text. Indeed, the silent era in the history of cinema has deeply impacted the semantic hierarchy in that area, the images being considered as the primary source of information, and the sound, and thus the voices, as a minor source of information. According to her, the concept of voice brings to light a contrast which is politically interesting to analyse when dealing with identity politics on screen. Voices on screen underline the contrast between image and sound, the contrast between the visible and the invisible, between intimacy and public sphere. It represents a threshold between one's subjectivity and intimate experience and the social and public sphere among which one might evolve. The voice is also a bridge between body and mind, and also between the character's personal experience and the cinematic experience of the spectator's experience becoming a collective one in the cinema theatre. Doan has particularly worked on the concept of voiceover in French la voix off, which is, according to her, a disembodied voice. Indeed, this disembodied voice, when dealing with female characters, is a way to empower these characters, to give them agency by ignoring the physical and very often eroticized in many classical films, the eroticized representation of their bodies, and solely focusing on the female discourse as acts of speech, voicing their opinions and their female experience of the world. The concept of disembodied voice is particularly interesting to analyze when dealing with dubbing, since the character's voice is no longer his, but the one of the dubbing actor. The concept of female voice has also been tackled by many translation scholars, and the field of feminist translation studies has tried to bring to light how translation plays an important role in revealing, or on the contrary, in amplifying gendered hierarchy between men and women, leading to the oppression of female identities in our societies. Here are a few references of feminist translation study scholars who have been working on that idea, and whom I consider as being some of the essential references when it comes to analysing the link between gender and translation. And I can go back to this slide if you want to afterwards. According to these feminist translation scholars, translation is used as a political means and is in itself a political tool, linking the concept of politics of translation and the idea of translation of politics. Translation practice should be seen as a political activity aimed at making language speak for women, making the feminine visible in language. Translation studies should be seen as a way to reveal the politics of oppression of the female identity. When it comes to audiovisual translation, in the past decade, several scholars have already published many interesting works on the link between gender and AVT. So for instance, Marcela Marco, who studied films such as East is East, Bended Like Beckham, and Calendar Girls. And in my thesis, I also have to take into account the particularities of AVT, its technical constraints, but also its theoretical frame and evolution, and which has been brilliantly analysed by scholars such as Schom, Abimark Nones, Diaz Cintas, Perez González, De la Bastita, Lambert, and many, many others. I've chosen to analyse the work, Annelies Ferral's work. So she's already analysed the show's French AVT, and I've chosen to analyse her work in order to present my own methodology. And so this is a third part of my presentation. Of course, my aim is absolutely not to pass a judgment on her methodology, since Ferral's article has been written a decade ago and the field of AVT has evolved since, and I benefit from this theoretical evolution. Also, her work was limited to the size of an article, while my work is a PhD thesis, so this gives me, of course, more time and space to go into details, okay? But the comparison with the work will help me expose my own methodology strategies. In her article, Gender in Audiovisual Translation, published in 2011, Annelies Ferrale demonstrates to what extent the liberties taken by the French AVT, especially in the dubbing, impact the French-speaking audience's understanding of the series' political discourse on female identities. According to her, the translation choices put into question the way the series inscribes itself in an American feminist rhetoric. The dubbing is naturalizing the feminine voices of the show in order to conform to the expectations and the convictions of the target audience in terms of gender. This naturalization process would explain some of the translation choices in the dubbing, choices which would thus function as some sort of cultural filter in order to render the American discourse more natural. In terms of methodology, Annelies Ferrale has organized her analysis around three main parts. So first part, feminist culture, the second part, gender equality, the public sphere, and the third part, feminist rhetoric. For each part, she gives a small contextual introduction, explaining the main theme and then illustrating her arguments by analyzing translation examples from the French subtitling and dubbing, which she compares. So on screen, you've got one of her translation sample analysis, which is part of the second part, I think. Ferrale's work done in 2013 is very similar to my first approach. So at the beginning of my PhD work, I would mainly work on the translation samples from the French dialogues that illustrate some discrepancy in terms of gender with the American dialogues. So I would compare the French dubbing and subtitling to the original script. So going back and forth from the written English script to what I heard for the dubbing and what I read for the subtitling. And then, just like Ferrale, I would classify these discrepancies under main themes and analyze them by comparing the French and the American version of these dialogue samples. In that example, the one you've got on screen, Ferrale analyzes the consequences of the mistranslation of the adjective successful. Ferrale doesn't give any specific contextualization of this excerpt, and her analysis doesn't take into account the images or the other elements of the audiovisual text, such as the sound, the setting, the lighting, the framing, all the elements that also play an important role in the construction of the meaning of the text. Ferrale thus restricts her analysis to the sole linguistic dimension and deals with AVT as if it were a simple linguistic transfer. However, images play an essential role when it comes to depicting female identities on screen, and many AVT scholars such as Jean-Jaurès and Perez Gonzalez have denounced this pure linguistic approach. And according to these two AVT specialists, when analyzing an audiovisual text, it is essential to take into account the specificity of the medium and to understand to what that audiovisual texts are multimodal. It means that the meaning is constructed through different modes, such as the images and the sound, and not just through the dialogues. This method has inspired me for my own methodology, which I've combined with a film analysis methodology. And so move on to the fourth part of my presentation. So I've decided to take into account, along the analysis of the dialogues, four main categories. So the cinematography, so what appears inside the frame, so the shot sizes, shot angles, camera movements, and depth of field, etc. Staging, so setting, lighting, costumes and props, the acting, the sound and the editing, which is a transition between shots. And this multimodal approach helps me develop a method which analyzes how the translation of the dialogues fits into the whole cohesion of the audiovisual text, and thus the complexity of the show's discourse on its female characters. Also, the other main element missing in Annelise Ferral's article is a thorough analysis of the series production and broadcast context, the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the show's meta-reflection on its own TV genre of this period. This contextualization is an essential element when analyzing discourses on political identities and on feminism, according to film and TV scholars such as Janet Steiger, Kim Akass, Janet McCabe, and Diane Negre. According to Diane Negre, the late 1990s and early 2000s represent a period of transition from one generation of women to another, in an age of neoconservatism and of retreatism when it comes to the representation of female characters. This retreatism phenomenon can be observed in the boom of the rom-com genre, romantic comedy, where feminist values from the second wave feminism are depicted as old-fashioned, restrictive, and essentialist. The concept of retreatism refers to the fact that female characters are presented in those films in a conservative way, and in which there are films in which values such as family, marriage, and maternity are presented as criteria of success. It is thus important to understand the show's discourse on these values and on its own genre, and how this discourse is then reflected or ignored in the translation choices. Also, some of the rom-com terminology characteristics from the 1990s, at the time when Sex and the City is broadcast on French television, or early 2000s, is not yet, then these characteristics are not yet used or adapted to the French language. So words such as slut shaming or single bashing or toxic masculinity, which you find in the first season of Sex and the City, are English words posing a real challenge even today when translating them into French. Although also it is important to take into account the numerous references in the show to its own genre, since these references contribute to the show's meta-dimensional, political, and very often ironical stance on its own genre. These references are not always contained in the dialogues, but also in the scenography, the cinematography, or the sound. However, they still need to be taken into account in the translation analysis in order to understand to what extent the series' political tone has been modified or not in the French adaptation. Another aspect I would like to tackle today with you is, of course, the F word, the term feminism. In her article, Annelise Ferrale uses the term feminist 32 times, the term feminism 19 times and the term gender 44 times without giving any specific definition or contextualization. Yet the concept of feminism differs from one context to another, one period to another, one domain to another. The multiplicity of the feminist movements and the plurality of their discourses and voices illustrate the various debates between the different feminist waves and perspectives, and need to be tackled when dealing with the translation of such matters. And it is the understanding of this complexity that constitutes, in my opinion, the most interesting challenge of my work. The show's discourse on female identities has been defined in many ways. It has been said that the show was post-feminist, it was from the third wave feminism, and post-feminism or third wave feminism, that's a big debate, and some critiques and scholars have also been as far as stating that the show was anti-feminist. But sexuality plays on this complexity and ambiguity. The terms feminism or feminist are never uttered throughout the first season of the show. And references to feminist movements are very subtle. These references demand a certain knowledge, and the feminist dimension of the show thus becomes a secret code. The narrative arcs constantly play on the questioning of feminist topics such as female sexuality and pleasure, maternity, female celibacy in the 1990s, abortion and marriage. These topics are always dealt with through a debate between the four friends, the four voices, and it never brings a clear answer to these issues. My methodology should take into account this aspect of the show, which I find constitute a very, very interesting challenge and sometimes a bit annoying too. So far, my strategy has been the one described by the TV studies scholar Amanda Lotz, who has underlined the fact that when dealing with female characters-centered series such as Sex and the City, the question shouldn't be whether or not the series is feminist, but rather if the show's discourse on female identities is subversive, or whether or not the show makes gendered stereotypes, I quote, inhabitable. I thus try to analyze the subversive dimension of the show and its use of stereotypes, and see whether or not the French AVT respects this subversive dimension of this work on stereotypes. In order to illustrate what I was just talking about, I'd like to present a multimodal translation analysis of two elements from the first episode of the show, so the pilot. The show plays on viewers' expectations in terms of romance in order to denounce how culture, literature, TV and cinema have contributed to the creation of a stereotyped vision of female celibacy. In order to do so, the show offers an ironical debunking of the Mr. Right figure. Indeed, the series offers a contrastive portrayal of Mr. Right, who is in turn presented as eligible bachelor and toxic bachelor in the very first episode of the show. The deconstruction of Mr. Right as a stock character is done through the ironical tone of Carrie's voiceover, Carrie's the main character, of her disembodied voice to refer to Mary Ann Doan's feminist concepts. This ironical perspective is thus female-centered, and the use of Carrie's ironical disembodied voice illustrates the series' meta-conscience of its own genre. This meta-conscience creates comedy, but asserts the inversion of power that takes place in the show by replacing the focus on female perspectives. And I'll try to demonstrate to what extent the French AVT tones down or even ignores the ironical dimension of the show, thus undermining the female voice. In the opening scene of the pilot, Carrie's voiceover presents the viewers with two different bachelor types. The city, I quote, the city's eligible bachelor type and the toxic bachelor type. And here you've got on screen so the city, the eligible bachelor. The label, the city's typically eligible bachelor, is given to Tim. You can like put, I mean, the image is very bad, but this is Tim on your screen. He's a character who only appears in the opening minutes of the pilot, and this man, we're told, is dating one of Carrie's friends, and he will end up breaking up with his friend in a very disrespectful manner later on in the episode. Carrie's voiceover describes their meeting and describes Tim's character as one of the city's typically eligible bachelors, and a few seconds later, the voiceover gives us more details on what constitutes this type of, what defines this type of bachelor. She says, Tim was 42, a well-liked and respected investment banker who made about $2 million a year. The use of the adverb typically is ironical. The adverb illustrates Carrie's reference to a specific type of bachelor and also a mockery of New York's upper class community. The irony is geographically anchored in a specific setting and location, but it's also a mocking comment on a specific genre. The adverb refers to the stereotype representation of the eligible bachelor character that you usually find in romance or in romantic comedies. That means a handsome, rich and upper class white male character. If we analyze the filmic elements of this shot, so you can't see it very much, but I'll try to describe it as precise as possible. We understand how the ironical dimension is confirmed by many elements from the cinematography, the setting, and the sound that all indicate that Tim seems to embody the romance bachelor who belongs to the subcategory of the successful businessman. The choice of the adverb typically is combined with the play on props, costumes, framing, and colors that all point to the idea of hyper masculinity. Tim is walking while talking on a phone in a spacious, luxurious office, surrounded by very expensive furniture and warm, rich golden colors. You've got the golden light from outside and the wooden color from the furniture. He is the perfect golden boy. He's wearing a business suit while talking on the phone in a very assertive tone about business ownership. The framing behind him is also very interesting to analyze. The vertical lines of the skyscrapers become symbols of economic success, but of course also of phallic power. Every element of this shot contributes to this idea of excess and thus to the idea that Tim embodies an archetype. The irony here is explicit and underlines the fact that this display of male power is completely undermined by Carrie's female voice. The second type of bachelor referred to in the first episode is the toxic bachelor. During the second part of the opening episode, a series of interviews is conducted and three men and 2 women appear individually on screen facing the camera, and they seem to be answering questions from a journalist we do not see. They all talk about the main differences between single men and single women. When the interviewees appear individually on screen, some of their personal information, such as their names, their marital status, and the profession, are displayed in a subtitle, as you can see with the last 2 screenshots on your screen. So 2 men, the men you can see on your screen, are defined in these subtitles as toxic bachelor, while the description of the women's marital status is more neutral. It is said to be, they're said to be unmarried woman. The choice of the adjective toxic to qualify their marital status is of course political. And elements from the cinematography, the editing, and the setting illustrate this type of bachelor. And it is the combination of the adjective toxic with all the other visual elements that highlights Carrie's ironic and mocking denunciation of hypermasculinity. Both men on screen appear on screen while working out at some gym. They appear in a close-up, they're sweating and out of breath, in sports clothes, revealing their muscles. They both try to explain why single women can have problems being in a stable relationship, and they justify their point of view by giving arguments that are somewhat sexist. They talk about the biological clock, about the hysterical neediness of the women's hysterical neediness, their bossy behavior, etc., etc. Cliches, very sexist cliches. And then the camera freezes, so we've got a camera freeze on their smirking faces with a subtitling, cutting them in half and letting the viewers understand how the adjective toxic is fully illustrated by their visual aspects. However, the French AVT concerning these two types of bachelors diminishes the subversive dimension of Carrie's voice. First of all, the adjective eligible is left out in the first sample. It's left out in the dubbing as well as in the subs. Oh, in the dubbing, sorry. The adjective is, however, very important. In the dubbing and the subtitle. This adjective is, however, very important since it helps the viewer understand that Tim is actually an archetype, a stock character. This adjective also helps create the link between the first type, the perfect businessman, and the toxic bachelor. There's a symmetry between eligible bachelor and toxic bachelor, and this symmetry, of course, is ironical. It means that the eligible bachelor turns out to be toxic. They're actually the same. But this idea disappears in the French version. The same logic applies to the adjective toxic in a second sample, which is translated by endurci in the French AVT, which in English would be like sworn bachelor, endurci. And this translation choice could be explained by the fact that the translation team maybe was looking for an idiomatic expression, and a French expression célibataire endurci is colloquial and underlines the idea that these men are installed in their celibacy, which seems to be the case in the show. However, the French expression is more neutral than the English, thus neutralizing Carrie's subversive voiceover, even though it would have been possible to translate literally the French with the French adjective toxique. So the French viewer French-speaking viewer doesn't understand that the images presenting both single men are actually the illustration of the adjective toxic, and the French AVT is thus at odds with the rest of the audiovisual elements of the shots. Finally, the neutralization of the ironical tone by the AVT continues with the omission of the adverb typically in the first sample, in the French dubbing As we've seen, the ironic use of the adverb typically and its visual illustration on screen contributes to the debunking of the Mr. Right figure. It seems that the translation team maybe has not recognized the ironical charge of this adverb and its integration in the whole audiovisual discourse. To conclude, this pluridisciplinary approach helps me understand my role as a translation scholar, which is to bring to light the political dimension of the source text and its translation. In other words, my work in analyzing Sex and the City's French AVT is feminist in the sense that I quote, translation scholars have explored some of the ways in which practitioners and academics might actively address power asymmetries in discourse and in practice. And these are Julie Berry's words. End of quote. The analysis of translation should thus be seen in this context as a way of making the feminine visible, to quote Louise van Vleuten, and create spaces where dialogues, debates, and discussions between different feminist communities can take place. Furthermore, my role, I think, I hope I do it, I hope I manage to do so, is more generally to enhance the utmost importance of AVT, as it is a way to bring together on the same screen different cultures, different languages, and different voices. And I would like to conclude with a quote from Ruby Rich, which concerns subtitling, but could be also applied to AVT in general. And I'll read it to you, but you've got it on screen. AVT allows us to hear other people's voices intact and gives us full access to their subjectivity. It acknowledges that our language, the language of this place in which we are watching this film, is only one of many languages in the world, and that at that very moment elsewhere they're watching movies in which characters speak in English while other languages spell out their thoughts and emotions across the bottom of the frame for all the audiences. It gives me hope. AVT, I'd like to think, is a token of peace. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this thought-provoking presentation that raises a number of questions. And I think probably we'll have time to obviously talk about your conclusions and about what will you shown us. But I think that the very important point you make is showing how audiovisual translation and audiovisual translation research can be used as a critical tool. So thank you very much for that. Right, now let's move on to the next speaker today, Francesca LEVERIDGE. Francesca is a postgraduate researcher in translation studies at the University of Nottingham. Her studies are funded by the AHRC Midlands Sport Cities Doctoral Training Partnership. Her thesis investigates the semiotic and narrative dynamics of subtitling in multilingual cinema and focuses in particular on the interactions between multilingualism, audiovisual translation, and themes of identity, otherness, and power relations. Francesca will give a talk entitled Minority Voices in Audiovisual Translation, Reflections, Refractions, and Transformation. And Francesca, with that, the virtual floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. If at any point it cuts out or anything, just shout. Okay, thanks for the introduction. And thanks, Sophie, for your presentation. Very organised, probably a lot more organised than mine. Yeah, I'm also very happy to be here to talk a little bit about my PhD research today. It looks at how subtitles, the main focus of it really is how subtitles kind of impact on the meanings that are generated both in and by multilingual films, specifically on narratives of identity, alterity, and power in the context of the films of cinema monde. I was talking about it earlier on. I presented at the conference last year that this kind of research network is formed out of. And when I first submitted my abstract for that, I was about 1 month into my PhD. And then by the time I presented, it was about 1.5 years. And now I've only got 1 year left. And the kind of thoughts that I've had, there's been a lot of, refractions, I suppose, and transformations of those. So I'll probably be reflecting on those today, on the questions that are sort of coming out of that, maybe rather than the answers per se. So yeah, the title of the presentation actually comes from a book of the same name, which is an edited collection by Paul Saint-Pierre and Professor Akass. And that in turn takes its name from words they say have all been used to describe the practice of translation and kind of varying connections that can be established between texts. So the first is reflection, which for them refers to the invisibility of translation. The second is refraction, which refers to the kind of negotiation between systems, texts, and cultures, which can often involve misunderstandings and misconceptions, as we all probably well know. And the third possibility to talk about is transformation. And in the actual volume, this is something that emerges largely through opening translation studies up to contexts where kind of traditional ideas about source and target text and kind of unitary languages between writing and translation are kind of called into question, which tends to be in contexts where mixed, non-standardized, hybrid and otherwise minority languages dominate. And these are ideas that I want to come back to towards the end of the presentation. But I think first what I want to do is kind of present some of the case studies that I've been working on in my thesis, and to talk about the ways that minority voices are or indeed can be translated and represented in audiovisual text. And the kind of emphasis here really is on how they can be represented, because often I feel like the sort of discussion that we have is how they're not represented. And yeah, it's no sort of it's common knowledge really that things like dialects, accents, and broken languages, amongst other minority linguistic forms, pose special challenges for translation, and especially for subtitling, where a kind of general tendency to homogenize, often perceived as a loss, can be observed. This quote from Chris Taylor that I use in all my presentations, which is sums it up very well. In dubbing, subtitling as opposed to dubbing, it moves ever further towards a standard language through its very nature as a written and therefore more formal genre. And there's a shift from the more specific to the more generic, in that lexis, terminology and expressions specific to regional and social varieties need to be generalized in order to guarantee comprehension over wide geographical and social divides. So that kind of sums up the problem quite nicely, but really it can be explained by the sort of constraints of subtitling that derive from the polysemiotic nature of the text that it deals with, and also the issues of time and space that accompany the shift from speech to writing, this intersemiotic shift. So dialogues in general need to be condensed quite a lot in subtitles in order for them to be read in the same time that the dialogues are spoken, as well as to allow us, the audience, to take in all the rest of the information that's being channeled through the audio and visual modes. And features of spoken language, so things like non-standard forms, pronunciation, markers of non-fluency, things like hesitations and interruptions, and grammatical and lexical errors, things like that, tend to make subtitled text a lot more complex to process, and therefore they tend to be omitted either through standardization or deletion in the subtitled text. And that's really because, in a way, subtitles, they're supposed to reflect speech, but in a refracted way, which ultimately leads to transformation. Sometimes that can be detrimental as far as representation of minority voices is concerned, and it can have an impact on things like characterization, narrative tensions, themes when minority languages are used in audiovisual text such as films. So I've got an example here from the film In Cela Dimanche by Yamina Benguigui, which is one of the films I look at as part of my study. And the film, I won't go into too much detail, but it's about it's a sort of tale of a family who migrate from Algeria to France, and it kind of explores their experience of being minorities in a new country, primarily through the lens of one of the main characters, Zouina, the protagonist, which is the mother of the family. And a really big part of the kind of narrative of her story, which is the case in a lot of migration films, is this language learning journey. So in the film, when she arrives, she can't speak French, and she's sort of more generally silenced. There's a gendered aspect to it, which I'll probably quite like to discuss at the end with Sophie. But she doesn't really speak, and it's through learning French that she manages to find a voice in the film. So this kind of growing proficiency that we see in the film is a really central narrative drive, and it's also a really big part of her characterization. So it's quite important that it should be represented in the translated text. However, we don't really get that for English viewers. The whole way through, there's a sort of same very standard use of English in the subtitles, things like grammatical errors, hesitations, repetitions, all these kind of things that point to her sort of lower level of proficiency, and the sort of the nuances of her voice are somewhat eliminated in the subtitles, and they kind of give an impression that the character has a much better command of the language than she does in the film. So we do lose a little bit of the point of her characterization and lose some of the narrative tensions that surround this language learning trope in the film. And kind of not silences her voice, but in a roundabout way, through giving her this voice, it kind of takes away from the symbolic value of the differences in her voice. With that said, and this overlaps with what Sophie was talking about, language is not the only means through which Zouina's status as a linguistic minority in the film is conveyed, and likewise, kind of the verbal aspects of dialogue are not the only things that she expresses in her speech that tell the viewer that as well. So things like the costuming, the clothes that she wears, the setting of her home, also the kind of more contextual information. We know that they've travelled from France, from Algeria to France, and we know that they're new in the country. So we have to give the audience some credit. There's a lot of other things going on that they can get information from. Similarly, things like her facial expressions and the way she's silent sometimes can show that she doesn't understand or that she's unable to articulate herself in interactions with French-speaking characters. And Also things like body language, there's scenes where she cries and she sort of has a very sad body language, which can show these feelings of alienation, which come from situations of linguistic, where communication is impeded, or the kind of linguistic incomprehension that arise in the film. So obviously, without taking all these different codes into account in film, such as things from the mise en scène, sound, different paralinguistic features, it's quite easy, I think, to fall into a trap of thinking that a strategy of standardization equates to loss of meaning. That's not always the case. And it's such a way that obviously these different codes can kind of compensate for where we're unable to express differences in the language of the subtitles themselves, because ultimately differentiating between codes and representing marcus orality can be a challenge, and it is one that does require sort of breaking the boundaries of the written language, and one that also increases when there are multiple languages or different codes at play. So we can contrast this example with one from another film that I studied, Deepan by Jacques Audiard, which is a 2015 film. It's also a migration film, but this is about a family of Tamil refugees who flee Sri Lanka, and they have a kind of temporary stay in France before making their way to England, which is the final destination. So language learning is still an important part of this film for the characters. It takes on less of a symbolic significance, though, as it's not kind of their sort of destination, their final destination. It's more of a kind of transient language, just something to help them get through and get by while they're there. And this does come through in the language of the characters as well, especially the main character, one of the main characters, Yelini. So often where her sort of linguistic knowledge fails her, she draws on things like objects, or she uses gestures, or even resorts to the use of English, which is her second language. In the film, it's implied, to kind of fill in the gaps in her linguistic knowledge where she can't express herself in French. And it's really interesting when you look at the subtitles, because it kind of looks as though the subtitle has done the same thing. There are lots of aspects where in the subtitles where we have things like ellipses, words that are kind of missing, rather than saying India is here and Sri Lanka is here, it really reflects the exact same way that the language is used by the character in the film. English is also brought into the subtitles, which I think is quite interesting, because when the character speaks in French and then kind of code switches into English, you'd expect that normally the English would not be subtitled, but it's brought in. And I think that's quite a subtle but very effective way of kind of reminding audiences of this, you know, the kind of otherness of this character in that context, and the otherness of her voice. So these different different sort of semiotic codes of the text, they don't only compensate, but they can also facilitate creation and kind of linguistic experimentation. I don't really think, or when we look at these subtitles, there's nothing there that's, you know, overly crazy. There's a few things like leaving in marks of hesitation, such as and ellipses and things like that. There's nothing too crazy, and simple sentence structures, but they're really effective in really aiding and enhancing our understanding of this character's identity and their kind of status as a linguistic minority, and to understand how they negotiate their relationships with other characters through language use. Now, a much less subtle example of how the kind of multimodal or polysemiotic nature of subtitle films can be used to support linguistic experimentation and subtitling when we're looking at minority languages comes from the film Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis. I can imagine quite a lot of you are familiar with this film. I probably don't need to go into the plot too much. But yeah, it's very well known, I think, for its translation, especially into English. And there's been some case studies of its translation to Spanish as well. And it's, I think, widely regarded as a kind of golden example of what can be done in subtitling, what kind of boundaries can be broken, and what we can do, what the kind of creative capacities of subtitles. So some interesting things that we have in here are the retention of source language lexicon. So we've got these things like references to food, there's also references to buildings, there's different interjections, there's, you know, other cultural phrases that are left in the subtitles and italicized. And that's important as well. Again, in the film, we have this kind of exchange of languages. So we've got this real narrative integration in the subtitles of these foreign lexicons. And we, the viewer, in an Anglophone context, also get to learn this foreign language along with one of the main characters, Philippe, who goes into this strange environment where he can't understand any of the other characters, which is, you know, the central kind of comedic drive of the whole film. We also have, on that note, there's orthographical alterations. So in the English language subtitles, we see this kind of use of in lots of the different words to replicate the pronunciation, the very distinctive accent that's spoken by the characters in the film. And again, that's quite disruptive. We've got this kind of mutation of the English language where the source language is being molded onto that language to create something new and to create something hybrid, and something that's actually really interesting and very much worthy of you know, having a look at in other films, to see if we can kind of replicate this kind of orthographical transgression of different languages, to see if that's possible in other films. And also there's another thing to note is mixing of non-standard forms in the target language itself. So I've just got a little screenshot here, and there's things like where the word like dandy, which I think you would associate perhaps with an American, maybe like a Southern American dialect of English. Also we, which for me would sound like it's come from Scotland or something like that in the UK. And then bank book, I mean, it's quite an unusual word. It seems quite old fashioned. So we've got this kind of drawing on all these different words that can overall evoke the connotations that are attached to the linguistic identities of the speakers in the film. So they're seen as people from the north are seen as these kind of old world, sort of, I don't know how to describe it really, sort of uncultured, kind of behind the times. So it's kind of pulls all these different things together, the stereotypes that are played on the film, and replicates that through the use of the target language forms. But this is only really possible because of the support of the polysemiotic network behind it. I mean, in any other film, if you were to kind of bring in, well, not any other film, but in one of the other films that we've looked at, if you were to bring retain source language lexicon directly, as you know, in their original form, it's quite disruptive. It could impact the viewers' accessibility to the film, and it could impede their understanding. But here, because of the kind of very visual nature of the jokes, the very visual nature of the gags, and also with the sounds as well, these kind of contextual and textual references. So we know in the film that the main characters go into this place where all the people speak an unintelligible dialect, and no one understands them, and we already know we're kind of set up for this. So we have expectations that come from the genre itself, that come from its nature as a comedy. And so I think on the one hand, it's good because the visual and the oral codes and the textual codes can really support this linguistic experimentation, but we also have to think about that as it is a constraint, because a subtitler doesn't really have any choice other than to experiment, because if you standardize, or if you even substituted some of these forms, it could ultimately end up clashing with what the viewer's seeing on screen and also hearing, because we are still exposed to the soundtrack because subtitles are additive. And even if we don't understand it, I mean, the dialogues in the film, they're so highly stylized, and this sort of forms of pronunciation are so exaggerated for the humor that I think viewers would start to wonder what's going on. It can end up ultimately breaking their suspension of disbelief. So it's a creative capacity that I think is born out of a constraint, and that's a really important thing to kind of bear in mind going forward in the presentation. So the last example I want to have a look at before going on to talk about something else is the film L'Esquive, which is a banlieue film, so it kind of belongs to the same broad genre of film as films such as La Haine, which maybe is a bit more well known. And this film in particular is an interesting one because it traces the daily life of a group of young people that live in the banlieue, who are practicing for a school play. They're performing the 18th century Marivaux play, Le Jeu de la Mort et des Arts. And it's a really interesting film because it juxtaposes three different varieties of French. We have standard French, we have the 18th century French of the play, and we also have this language that's developed out of these you know, suburban housing estates on the outskirts of large French cities. So very linguistically codified and highly diverse, different borrowings from languages such as Arabic, a form of wordplay, and sort of more general forms of slang, and also quite a lot of taboo language and swearing. And the linguistic analysis of the subtitles I sort of carried out shows that there is evidence of what is termed a dialect replacement strategy, which is often observed in these films where the language that's spoken by the young people that live in this environment is substituted with African American English and Americanism. So we've got here an example of phonetic corruption. So words ending in ER are changed to end in A. Things like mom, which is just more American, and then words like fat, there's also fly and some other words that belong to African American English. So they give this kind of American feel to the text. On the one hand, it's quite a meaningful thing to do. It's a meaningful substitution to make because parallels are often drawn between the environment of the banlieue and the environment of the US project. So subtitles recognize that, and they recognize this kind of perhaps potential double meaning that there is in the semiotic channels of the film. We look at the environment. For me, this kind of grey tower blocks gives the kind of same connotations as urban environments on the sort of peripheries of large cities in the UK. So it has similar connotations as well. So you could maybe also substitute it with a form of sociolect or a non-standard language variety emanating from somewhere like on the outskirts of Manchester or even in London. For the UK, but I also recognise that is not without its problems, because you can't just necessarily map one culture onto another, and this strategy is actually criticised quite a lot because it kind of displaces the characters' identities in a way. It's a sort of paradoxical silencing of one minority language with another that kind of ultimately leads audiences to navigate the banlieue via their knowledge of US street culture. And it is seen to sort of downplay the symbolic significance that the non-standard variety serves in the film altogether. So again, tendency to homogenize perceived as a loss is typically observed. So some reflections then. I do think it is I think it's also important to reveal the sort of symbolic value of these different constructions, but ultimately it is going to entail quite a lot of difficulty to the translator concerned. You know, pairing these specific rhetorical devices from one text to another, especially in the case of when we're dealing with things like minority languages, like these hybrid codes, like these different accents, like these dialects, because they themselves kind of call into question fixed ideas of translating from a sort of one monolithic language and culture to another. And it's also a question of resources in subtitling. When we look at the difference between Insular Dimanche and Deepan, not that I want to compare them too much, but you know, one's got a lot more dialogue than the other. So to really try and render that as exactly as to render the dialogue of Insular Dimanche in the same kind of literal fashion as Deepan would ultimately be quite chaotic for the viewer to take into account and would probably just impede their understanding of the story and the characters. And so would end up silencing the voice more so than standardizing the dialogue. So there's a quote in the book that I've mentioned in the introduction to the presentation, which kind of really stuck out to me and said about this idea that translation has often been described in terms of loss and forces have been marshaled to minimize its negative effects, and translation is ultimately reduced to mere reproduction or reflection of an effect of an intention of a message. And so thinking about this example of Lesquide as well, often with this use of African American English, a counterpoint is people propose a counteraction of this homogenizing effect would be to retain maybe some words of Arabic, and we see that in the film's subtitles. There's a few instances where the phrase Inshallah is retained, which, as Hannah Sylvester has pointed out in her brilliant thesis on subtitling of the banlieue film, is just enough to signal the presence of this word in the sociolect and to kind of give an idea about the codes that influence and make up this minority language. But I think it's not just a case of counteracting it. I think what's often neglected here is that we have to think about the sort of the sum of all of these parts. And actually we've got, when we put the different codes together in the context of the kind of semiotic information and the contextual information that is mediating the viewer's interpretation, what we have is the representation of an Arabic inflected street slang, which ultimately, in terms of the film, actually mirrors, it reflects the construction of the minority code that is portrayed in the original dialogues. And so, well, it does affect it, albeit in a refracted way. Obviously it changes it, and ultimately I think this is something that this kind of thinking is what can transform perspectives on loss and homogenization in translation. And what I've highlighted here is, as Saint-Pierre said, that paradoxically in these kind of discussions of loss and homogenization, what's being minimized is exactly what is specific to translation, which is that it brings something new and that it constitutes growth and interaction in a new context, a new reading and a new writing. I think this is especially true in the context of subtitling because of the kind of material and linguistic layers that they add to films. So because of their ancillary nature, subtitles, they both complement and supplement the film's other semiotic systems. Subtitles films constitute hybrid spaces in which different linguistic forms come into contact and sometimes conflict, and through this intermingling produce a text that is more than the sum of its parts. So it's a process of reflection, refraction and transformation. And so some of the work that I've been doing recently on subtitling cinema monde, I'm arguing that subtitles open up spaces in which forms of translingual writing emerges. In that context, it could also be multilingual writing. It can be writing that hinges on linguistic variation and other forms of plurality. And ultimately, translation is both a necessity and a contingency. And I think this kind of thinking really has some implications on the way that we think about audiovisual translation and its relationship with creative processes of constructing and representing different voices in subtitling, especially minority voices. And the examples that I have shown here do show how these homogenizing tendencies I identified earlier on can be circumvented through this kind of stretching and creative use of resources that sees difference in subtitling as not so much something to be portrayed as it is embodied and created by subtitling in itself. And I think that this requires a paradigm shift of sorts, one that kind of allows for the representation of diversity across different languages, as well as within them, moving away from maybe sort of more binary models that trace a film's pathway from one language to another and this kind of comparison between codes, to a more dynamic model of the productive zone that's situated at the intersection between languages. So this space where all these different languages and codes and media kind of collide and collude to produce something else. So refractions then, how do we go about this? And I think this, going back to the book, it's all about opening up translation studies to minority voices in terms of the sort of disciplinary aspect perhaps, or different codes that can kind of expand definitions of what subtitles are, what subtitles do, our understanding of what languages are, and how they kind of come together. And so my project is really situated at the intersections of audiovisual translation, film studies and post-colonial translation studies, which amongst other cultural theories of translation remains quite undeveloped in audiovisual translation. So in a way I'm trying to sort of reflect, refract and also transform. Now, with the last kind of framework, it is grounded in literary translation studies. So obviously I'm going to have to adapt this for my work because films and literature are not the same thing. And what I've actually done is I've then structured my case studies of films around different conceptual frameworks, which can account for an analysis of translation, which can account for analysis of film, but also are related to kind of more broader themes of post-colonial translation studies perspective. So I've got three here. I don't have time to really talk about them too much, but they're voice, heteroglossia and displacement. Haven't mentioned the films for the displacement case study, but I mean, it's amazing to kind of reconceptualize these subtitles as having taken on this semiotic and narrative role where they become a minority code that displaces and kind of changes power dynamics between the viewer and the film, and also the characters within the film. And this is, I suppose, what the sort of broader aim of doing this is. It's finding frameworks that can account for a broader range of resources that contribute to the representation of minority voices in film, so beyond just the solely linguistic content of the dialogues and subtitles. Then analyze the semiotic and dynamic impact of subtitles on the meanings generators, looking at their kind of semio-narrative properties, or semio-semantic properties, perhaps, in terms of the diegetic and extra-diegetic meanings that are conveyed in films. And then really to look at how minority voices or representations of minority voices are produced as a result of the intersemiotic nature of subtitling, rather than in spite of it. So not thinking about how forces can be marshaled in to counteract homogenizing tendencies, but rather to actually think about how they are produced from the heterogeneous process of translation itself. And so I think really what it's kind of come to for me now is, originally I went into the project wanting to look at how minority voices were kind of translated and what their impact was on the translation process. or how translation process impacted on the representation of these voices. But what's kind of happened is that in doing this, I've actually found out more about subtitles and thinking more about what subtitles are and what they do. And as I said, there's a bit of a tendency, I think, to take quite a binary view in audiovisual translation that sort of traces the voice from one code to another. But the text here that we're dealing with, they don't really maintain these distinctions because languages are intermixed. Translation becomes a form of writing. Originality does not depend on anteriority, and translations are asked to become visible and play a social role. And different paradigms for and of translation are constituted. And this quote kind of stuck out to me because what I've found really is that because of the representation of minority voices in films, because of the kind of themes that these films tackle and the way in which they tackle them, it actually forces us to consider subtitles in a different way. They're not just a representation of the minority voice, but they're very much essential to and co-constructive of that voice. They're an essential part of the narrative and semiotic fabric of the overall film. And you know, things like translation, language contact and conflict are all thematized in the films, and then subtitles as a mode of translation actually highlight, emphasize and embody these linguistic, communicational and interpersonal tensions portrayed in the films depicting linguistic minorities, as I've shown, not in all examples, but in some examples. And this is what's important, I think, showing what can be adjusted, maybe not just showing what we already know, but showing what can be adjusted, and now thinking about how do we imply this, how do we apply this, and how do we push it forward in the discipline. So in terms of concluding thoughts, hopefully everyone's sort of still with me. So I feel like where I'm at now in terms of conclusions is, where do we go from here? How do we continue to reflect this across the discipline? What kind of paradigms of and for translation of minority voices can we find in audiovisual translation that can account for the kind of fluidity of the process and the product that we're dealing with? How can we account for fluidity of different contexts and practices? You know, how do we define what a minority voice is? How do we define what a minority language is? Are they all the same? I mean, I'm using frameworks that are very much tailored to the films under study that I work with. Is that useful? Is it more useful to find one kind of framework that can be applied to multiple contexts? Then the next question is, what do we do with it after we look at it from a research perspective? Can we translate this into practice? How do we push it from one kind of medium to another? Is that possible? I'm not sure. And then in terms of transformation, what is the value, I think, of continuing to open up AVT to minority disciplinary voices and subtitling practices? Which ones do we select? Why do we select them? And with what aim and with what purpose? So hopefully that might raise some interesting points for discussion. Thanks everyone very much for listening to me. And yeah, I look forward to any questions about my project in general or my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for such a fascinating talk. So let's go into the Q&A portion of this event. I'm sure our speakers will be would love to answer your questions. So I'm going to open it to the floor in a second, but I would like to ask both of you a question, just, you know, as a warming up. I mean, you both seem to, well, you both stressed an aspect that that has to do with the notion, an excessive emphasis on the notion of loss on the one hand in translation studies, and on an excessive focus and an almost exclusive focus on discrepancies between source and text, source text and target text. And in other words, you stress the problem of approaching the study of translation by adopting an exclusively comparative analysis that focuses exclusively on the linguistic element in audiovisual texts. So this is an element that I think I would like to hear your opinion on this. What do you think of approaches that focus on losses and discrepancies, and yes, what is your opinion about this kind of approach, as you both emphasize the importance of the multimodal dimension in audiovisual translation research. So the problem of, dealing with audiovisual texts in terms of this binary view, moving from a text A to a text B, and so on and so forth. Yes.
Can I jump in? So I think they definitely have their merits. I think they have their place. I mean, fundamentally, because of the nature of audiovisual translation, because of the nature of subtitling in particular, because you literally have got one text which is joined to another one. They are literally and physically bound together. You can't help but compare. They often give rise to comparison, they give rise to clashes. And I think that multilingual films really exacerbate this kind of vulnerability of subtitling, but also peculiarity in that they produce great potential for clashes, but also I think for creativity and for creation. And I think that's kind of where the multimodal approach comes in. I think also you can still have that in a linguistic approach, but I think for me, the question that I feel comes up the most when we look at analyses of subtitle films, or even maybe in dubbing, I don't look into that too much, but especially with linguistic difference and forms of linguistic diversity, the question always seems to be kind of to what extent can X form of language that's so significant in the source text be retained in the target text, rather than, well, what happens when these two texts are put together and what kind of representation is made out of the two of them. And I think when that sort of question is very much rooted in loss, it's like rooted in an expectation of loss rather than in one of that looks at the potentials of subtitling or of audiovisual translation. And that for me, I think is what I want to kind of try and do with my work, is really like show the creative capacities of subtitling and subtitles rather than focusing on what they can't do, which I just sometimes feel dominates a little bit. I don't know, maybe Sophie, you disagree, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I'm actually asking it myself a lot, because I'm actually writing my thesis on this aspect of quality. What do you do when you compare two texts, and how do you analyze two texts in a way of trying to limit this a bit prescriptive vision, or this binary vision of what is good translation. I think it's very difficult. I'm trying to reflect on that. Well, that was my first approach when I was working on my first approach of Sex and the City was to compare through discrepancies the source text with the target text. So like comparing the dialogues, the American dialogues with the French dialogues, and I was only focusing on discrepancies. And at some point I felt that it was not a very good idea, because I was missing a lot of things which were quite positive about the French dubbing and subtitling of Sex and the City, but I didn't know how to take this into account without spending 40 years on the analysis of the French season. And so I think, yes, this is what you were saying, Francesca. I think the multimodal approach is quite, it helped me a lot when I discovered this. I was, oh, okay, it'll help me limit my judging vision of the French dubbing and subtitling. And so I force myself, when I analyze something, a theme or something in Sex and the City, to see the positive aspects of the French dubbing and subtitling, and see how. So I would start with a film with a very detailed analysis of the theme. So, for example, sexuality, how sexuality is depicted in Sex and the City, and this would be the film analysis, TV analysis part. And then I would try to analyze how it has been conveyed through the dubbing and has been respected, or the show's discourse on sexuality has been respected in the AVT, and then I'll try to work on the discrepancies. This is, yeah, but it's very tricky. I think it's a very interesting notion, discrepancies, and yeah, and it's also I think it's the same thing with you, Francesca. I've got my personal feelings coming into my work, so my feminist opinions. I'm trying to be very, I mean, my activism basically me being like convinced feminist, and I try to limit this because otherwise, of course, I'm going to read too much into the translation choices and sometimes like forget about some positive aspects of the AVT. Don't know if it helped answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, the notion of loss is extremely relative from the point of view of viewers. Have you taken into account the viewer's perspective in your analysis?
Yes, to an extent. I don't, unfortunately, you know, my kind of thesis is really beyond the scope of getting any sort of empirical data. But for me, one of the main things that I'm trying to look at as well is because I'm looking at multilingual films, the kind of target audience of those films can be, when you're really trying to get into the kind of idiosyncrasies of viewership, it starts to become a very messy affair, and especially in the case of multilingual films. And something, for example, that I look at is, so I look at subtitling both of French, so subtitling into French of French multilingual films and also into English. I get to look at these shifts, and that's really cool. But when you think about, with, say, for example, you've got a film in French and Arabic, and only the Arabic dialogues are subtitled, and you're like, well, okay, that's their subtitles, why is that? And then you start drawing conclusions about, well, this is suggesting something about a main audience and a main language, and even these films of cinema monde, which are meant to be, you know, sort of hybrid and sort of calling into questions these old binary distinctions between French and Francophone, still can't quite shake off, you know, that the standard French language is the main language, and we see that come through in the subtitling decisions. And I'm not saying that that's kind of a choice necessarily of directors, this sort of ideological thing. It's obviously down to things like financial aspects and other sort of ideological factors that are at play. But in terms of audience, I think you can tell a lot about an audience or an intended audience from the way the films are actually translated, rather than trying to work for it from the other way around. Does that make sense?
Exactly. I agree 100% with you, because well, for example, in the case of Sex and the City, it's clearly a women, it's targeted to women, it's a women's genre. It's a well, it's not exactly a romantic comedy, but it's depicted as such. And of course, this genre is very interesting, and it's the topic of a lot of feminist reflection on in film theory, and the fact that, and sometimes the way I try to analyze the AVT in and the things I've noticed, for example, in Sex and the City, is that things which are depicted as completely typical of romantic comedy is exaggerated in the AVT. For example, or for example, Charles, I mean, all the characters are a bit, in the translation, are a bit exaggerated in order to fit like some kind of categories, romantic comedy categories. Or for example, the way the sexuality has been translated, it's very well translated in French, and it's sometimes a bit over translated. So you've got more, I mean, because in Sex and the City you've got a lot of very crude words, and like a lot of there's a political stance in naming taboos through sexuality, and the French AVT, the French dubbing, is very, very good. I mean, has respected this concept. There's no taboos in the French dubbing, but sometimes it goes a little bit too far. So, for example, I mean, vulgarity is a bit too much in the French AVT, and it's not the case in the American version, because well, this is my analysis. They have analyzed Sex and the City as a series, which is a romantic comedy, but also a romantic comedy which talks about sex. And so they need to exaggerate this in terms of like maybe making it more understandable for a French audience that this series is about sexuality. And so you've got, sometimes instead of having loss, I mean some kind of loss or some kind of under translation, you've got I mean, a bit an exaggeration and sometimes a bit too much in the translation, which is also very interesting because then you can see how they have analyzed Sex and the City in terms of audience, I mean, expected audiences or things like that. So I think it's quite interesting.
We have a comment